ultimately here, I think we do want to have a little bit of a wrap-up discussion on these cards here, because I think that I think actually the price versus performance of the cards, if we take away all the stuff about neural rendering, if we take away all the stuff about multi-frame generation, if we take away any future expectations of performance and just focus on the pure now, I actually think that price versus performance with these cards is surprisingly decent, because they are coming in at or around the cost of those existing GPU lines, except for the 5090. And the 5090 is again extending you past the level of the 4090 rather, into a new bracket of performance where it is compelling in that sense at 2,000 American dollars. And I personally think that here, NVIDIA's actually done a pretty good job in terms of price versus performance, but I don't know how you feel there, Alex. Accepting these technologies, how do you feel about price versus performance?
So like
here?
accepting all the stuff that we talked about here, and we're just looking at like if we were to run a rasterized title versus on this gen card and the previous gen card, we would see almost like what I would describe as like a refresh level of performance in a previous generation context, like the best refresh level, like this isn't a good example, like 1070 to 1070 Ti or 2070 to 2070 Super, the best level of refresh where you're getting for an extremely similar price of like a 15 to 20% boost or something like that. And that is like a good refresh level, but it is definitely not within the expectations, I would say, of what you would see gen on gen 10 years ago or something like that. And well, yeah, 10 years ago, roughly 10 years ago to 15 years ago, time is advancing. Don't forget that. And I think this is one of the things that consumers are struggling the most with. And I think it's reasonable to struggle with this on a certain level because, you know, inflation and the fact that you can only get so much into these smaller manufacturing processes. This is not like a large node jump or something like that. So the card can only get better in certain ways. And Nvidia puts it out for a price that they think people will buy. Now, not everyone will buy it at that price. And we've seen that before with the RTX 4080, which did not sell at all very well. And so they had to bring out the 4080 Super, which it was essentially a price cut in terms of how much performance per dollar you were getting there. We'll see what ends up happening here. But in the immediate term, I would say this is not a GPU series you should upgrade to if you have a good RTX 4000 GPU. I think that's like the lay of the land in that general direction. That's typically how it is for most generations of GPU, though, for a while now. You don't just buy a new GPU every 2 years when they come out. Most people don't. So I don't think that's too surprising. But if you were one of those people who was buying a new GPU every 2 years because 3,000 to 4,000, 4,000 to 5,000, well, then this is disappointing if you only look at it in the rasterization, pure performance metric of that. But that is not what Nvidia is advertising their cards are. And it's also arguably not the way computing is going to be going. And it is not going that way. Rich talked with, you talked with Mark Cerny. And I was about to say, Rich, you talked with Mark Cerny. And he very explicitly said, like, we're not going to be getting these massive teraflop increases in our GPU. There's a limit to how much fast memory we can put in these things. Before it becomes price inefficient to sell to a consumer at something sub 1,000 US dollars, right? And the same thing is applying to GPUs right now, and it is a hard pill to swallow. But at least in this aspect, NVIDIA is coming up with alternative branches of computing and ways of advancing computing that more readily leverage the hardware we can increase. And I think stuff like neural rendering is a future workload that is very interesting. The cards themselves, though, like this 12 gigabyte, 16 gigabyte thing, I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, there's never going to be enough frame buffer for some of these low-end cards, I fear. That's kind of a perennial problem. Hopefully, I mean, 8 gigabytes is going to see possibly, according to the leaks, possibly return with the 5060, which
that would
will be a
not a
issue.
good thing. That would make me very sad, actually.
That'll make Alex tear his hair out slightly. Try to tear my hair out. But I think here, those the baseline performance improvement here, I think is like, it's, it is what it is, seeing as we're not getting a big node jump. I think people kind of forget just how big the node jump from Samsung 8 nanometers to TSMC 5 was with last generation. That was like gigantic. It's almost like 2 full nodes of a performance improvement, or 1.5 nodes. It was a big performance improvement. And I think that even as we go, we're not at the 3 nanometer node for consumer GPUs yet, but I think what we're seeing from other areas of the silicon industry is that scaling from this point onwards is getting a lot harder, a lot more expensive, and less and less compelling. So I think we should get very used to these kinds of improvements in features and not so much in raw rendering capability, or in brute force rendering capability, as Nvidia sometimes puts it. For the frame generation features, I think it's possibly quite compelling. I think we need to really see exactly how it looks in practice here, and exactly how much scaling it gives these cards above their prior generation companions, above the 3000 series. Because for me, like, I do have a pretty high refresh rate monitor. I have a 170 hertz monitor. To maximize that monitor, you'd be thinking with one of these new cards, maybe running at 40 FPS internally and going to like 160 FPS-ish with frame generation, or perhaps something more conservative with just 3x frame generation there. So to make use of it with a higher end card, I think people have sketched out an idea in their heads of, okay, I'll get like a 240 hertz monitor, or I'll get a 200 hertz monitor, or something in that range, and use frame gen from like 60 hertz, 50 hertz base frame rate. I think that makes a lot of sense. As we go down the stack, the potential of frame generation technology in improving frame rates becomes bigger, but also the internal frame rates that you'll need to achieve in order to achieve like realistic refresh rates for that class of hardware becomes lower and lower. So I think there are certain trade-offs here, maybe with multi-frame generation, that will show up in these cards, where like right now, I'm very comfortable enabling frame generation on almost any game on my system currently. I feel like it provides a good experience. I'm happy with that. For multi-frame generation, is there that same utility? Certainly at very high refresh rates, but for kind of like this mid-range to high-end hardware, it's gonna be interesting to see how that shakes out, because it's not a pure performance increase, like Rich says. It's an FPS increase primarily, right? It's not
Right.
It's kind of a performance increase, kind of not. It's giving you that fluidity. It's not giving you that decrease in input latency. It's not necessarily giving you a totally artifact-free experience. So I think we'll have to see how that works out in practice. That's a trickier subject to address, but it could be very compelling for sure. I imagine for some categories of products, it will end up being very compelling. But that's not the only aspect of this new graphics card that is interesting here, because we also have some discussion here of NVIDIA's unique software package and experience with DLSS 4, with neural rendering, that possibly is elevating them above their competition to some degree. So how much value should we attach to that kind of NVIDIA package of features? Probably talking about multi-frame generation here, but also all the other DLSS suite of technology of features, Reflex, now Reflex 2, neural rendering features of different kinds. Like, there's a lot to offer here.
So I think I would say this is the way NVIDIA frames it. But you as a consumer, you should really look at your own priorities. And these things are incredible from a future looking perspective, the neural rendering and whatnot. But they are limited to a certain subset of games that will only be coming out in the next like 3 years at most, and it'll be a very small subset of them. So you have to look at like your gaming catalog. And when you do that, and the type of games you play, you may see that something like the RTX 50 series doesn't apply to you. And that's totally fine. You don't need to get FOMO and start wanting to buy it as a result just because it's the latest and greatest. In that aspect. Another thing is that some of these are force multipliers for spec problems, I would call them, on the current GPUs. Like the neural texture compression actually sounds amazing if there is a card of 5070 caliber with 12 gigabytes of VRAM. That sounds amazing. It would be a perfect way to make sure that this card can actually run the latest titles without turning settings down. Same with DLSS 4 multi-frame generation, where it's going to improve the refresh rate responsiveness on your display for your eyes, etc., at the cost of input latency potentially versus not having it on. And the new DLSS 4 model for frame generation uses less VRAM. I think they touted at 4K 400 megabytes less, for example. So those features technically make lower VRAM mounts more compelling, but they are not in every game out there. DLSS 4 is not in every game out there. This neural texture compression would be amazing if it was in every single game, but it isn't, and it isn't currently. And I kind of feel like the RTX 5000 series here is a little bit more niche of an upgrade, and as a result, it's a little bit like RTX 2000 when it released in 2018, where the sell is a bit harder because the software isn't there yet, and we need a greater industry adoption of the software. So that's kind of how I see it at the moment. But, I'm still very excited to see all these next gen technologies at the same time. But I don't know, the price performance thing, we as an industry are going to need to find out a way to start talking about things beyond just FPS, because the experience that our GPUs can offer us now is a lot more than things that aren't just about FPS. It's about image quality, it is about input response, and it is about smoothness, maybe. And I kind of felt like Nvidia's angle there was smart, but it is definitely very calculated to make sure you think this is an incredible buy. So,
I also think it's tricky because I think Nvidia has a great platform here in terms of these technologies, but most of them are still coming to 4,000 and 3,000 and
very
even
important.
2,000. So maybe the performance isn't there to run all these new features on an RTX 2060, but gosh darn it, Nvidia will let you do it. So I would just say that like the Nvidia platform at this point, stretching back for 6 years of graphics technologies, basically over 6 years of graphics technologies, they're going to take care of you. They're going to give you most of these features, not all these features, but most of these features are going to run, many of them in a performant manner on that class of hardware. And you probably have some confidence that this graphics card that you buy in 2025 is going to be supported with new features into 2027, into 2029. You're kind of buying into this NVIDIA platform. They're showing extremely good, almost Apple-like support for these older GPUs at this point, which I think is very encouraging. Other vendors aren't necessarily at this level. Like DLSS 4 runs on a 2070, but FSR 4 won't even run on like a 2022 RX 7900 or anything like that. So that's kind of a disappointment there. NVIDIA has obviously been a little bit more future looking, but I totally take on board the fact that like a lot of these technologies won't be deployed in games for a while. People need to temper their expectations. You look at something like Mega Geometry, who knows how long it'll take for that to be integrated in a game in kind of a manner like we saw in the NVIDIA demos there.
Precisely.
A lot of these technologies can probably be integrated a little bit faster, like with the RTX hair, but some things will take a little bit more time there. So I guess closing out here, we have a little bit of a point here, which is how do we review hardware and how do we think about graphics technology in an era where people debate even what performance is in graphics hardware because of the proliferation of various fake frames, as they're pejoratively called, or AI generated frames, frame generation, these kinds of technologies that I think are becoming very, very important to the PC experience, but also engender a ton of controversy. And the normal way of benchmarking PC parts is to test them with ISO settings against each other in the same workloads and do a performance per dollar chart and call it a day. But I think that's changing quite a bit now here, isn't it, Alex?
Yeah, and I think we just talked about it essentially, like the manufacturing is making this the way it is right now. And I think the reviews, you can obviously look at any review what you want, but if it was just focusing on FPS only, it wouldn't be describing a lot of the rest of the software package that the GPU might be offering you. And I think there is indeed a way forward, and it's not looking at the typical ISO settings, things that you mentioned for GPU reviews ever since the 90s. But it's looking a little bit about like maybe how you would review a car, or you would review, any or sort of luxury product. And GPUs are a luxury product. You don't need to have a GPU for the most part. And I think looking at those, where if they just say how quickly it goes from 0 to 60, or how like braking distance, or I don't know, you're not getting much there out of a review. But if you look at like safety features, media features in a car, like the expanded palette and like a larger subjective take, a holistic take of the product, that's how you would maybe inform the consumer best, especially considering the manufacturing things we talked about earlier. But that's kind of the way I see it right now. DF has been pretty good in going this direction because we have a different slant, but the rest of the industry doesn't necessarily have that. because consoles were limited enough where we had to create a new angle to talk about them. But GPUs haven't been this way for a long time. So I'm very curious to see how other GPU reviewers will go about it. Image quality comparisons, I have no idea. It's their own, they will create up some of their own things. But for now, I think we're going to be pretty equipped for talking about this future, but I'm very curious to see how other people maybe come up with new angles to talk about it. There was Battle Nonsense a few years ago. That was a really interesting angle that kind of fell off, like the input latency one. But maybe that will start entering the discussion more and more.
I think Alex just came up with a better analogy than I did, because I was just going to compare graphics cards to consoles. But I think that the car analogy is maybe a little bit more fitting there, because you have the fit, you have the finish, you have all these features, you can kind of live in it, you can see the world through it. I think it's a more compelling analogy there. But, it is very much something where you aren't just comparing parts per parts. You're not comparing like flow rate here. You're not comparing throughput. You're not comparing things like this. We're not comparing like filters or fans or things that can be just measured in an absolute sense. We're comparing different platforms that come with their own unique hardware and software features, aren't available on other platforms, or to the extent they are available, they're available in very different forms. And so to some degree, like when you're trying to reconcile different cards together, you have to think about exactly how am I using this card, and are the various vendors' different software packages attractive to me for my own uses. I think that's the key part of it now. I don't think that a ton of this is going to come down to performance per dollar in native rendering. I don't think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that gamers are very much there, because like Nvidia has internal telemetry that says that 80% of gamers with an RTX capable GPU are using DLSS in their titles. So apparently people do tend to make use of these technologies, which I think makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I mean, I think more optimistically, I think AMD and Intel are pursuing similar technologies to Nvidia. I'm sure that something like FSR4 is hopefully going to be more comparable to modern day DLSS than FSR2 was to DLSS 3 or FSR3 was to DLSS 3. But I do hope that we basically get to a point in the PC industry where we have broad parity in terms of features, at least having the features across different kinds of hardware, where we have a multi-frame generation solution from AMD, from Intel, where we have something like a Reflex 2 solution that's kind of extrapolative, generative fill, interesting latency reduction solution across vendors, things like that. But for now, it's definitely a little bit more of a tough thing to review hardware. And I do think you need to put each card in its own context of what you can do with it. What's the limit of what you can do with that card? What's the kind of typical gameplay experience of using that card? How would you typically use that card in conjunction with super resolution, in conjunction with frame generation, in conjunction with reflex, in conjunction with all these technologies to enable the best experience on any class of card? I think that's a tougher discussion.
Yeah,
that for sure I think we do a pretty good job at that, but it's a tough discussion for sure.